So the other day, I was just researching about some Genshin lore and I came across this really old theory from like a couple of years ago that for some reason theorizes that Zhongli is a descender. Yeah, you know, the beings that do not come from Teyvat. One of the theory's two main anchor points hinges on the lore piece of the Stone Tablet compilation, which states that Zhongli descended upon Pluie, which many people took as literally descended from like above, and therefore means that Zhongli is a descender. But what I found to be the more interesting part is the second anchor to this theory. And before I mention what it is, I want to put a spoiler alert for those of you who have not played the Sumeru Archon quest and everything that comes after, just to be safe. Best to turn around and click away if you want to experience that for yourself. If you haven't and still want to be spoiled, then okay. Alright, with that out of the way, the interesting part of the second anchor to this theory is the notion that his character's story is not as straightforwardly affected by the changes Irminsul made when Greater Lord Rukkhadevata makes Teyvat forget about her, which might make it possible for Zhongli to be a descender, as he is seen to not be as affected by this change compared to all the other obvious changes we see in character stories and lines such as Nahida and all the other Sumeru characters. The section they were talking about in particular was his character story 5, which before the change says, as time passed, many of the 7's titles changed hands, and only 2 remain of the first 7, Rex Lapis and the Anemo Archon. And then after the Sumeru Archon quest where we make Teyvat forget about Rukkhadevata, it changes to, as time passed, many of the 7's titles changed hands, and only 2 of the first 7 remain in positions of rulership, Rex Lapis and the Anemo Archon. Now, before I get into how this all really correlates to my theory of this video, which mainly focuses on Irminsul, let's look at this Zhongli is a descender theory first, because in my opinion, based on the rest of the game's lore and the reasoning as to why these people believe that Big Dong Man is a descender, I think it is highly improbable that Zhongli is a descender. The Stone Tablets one is simple to not think too much of. The term descended is widely used in any literature to describe the arrival of a deity of some sort. Just because they use the word descend doesn't always mean that they actually came around from the heavens, and also vice versa. Just because we don't use the word descend doesn't mean that that being is not of the heavens when we're describing some grand arrival of a creature. Look at some of the primordial ones' description. A lot of them describe them as just simply arriving, came by, and not descending. Yet we know for a fact that they are widely known as the first descender. Guizhong is described to have descended as well. And while the theorizer said that this was a translation error and that it shouldn't have meant that, I prefer to err on the side of what is just already on the written lore. But if that's not convincing, then let's look at it in the sense of the descenders. There are 4 known descenders, and the last one to have been recorded was the Traveler. Us. That means that between the period of the 3rd descender and the Traveler, there was no other descenders at least officially recorded. Now the 3rd descender is dead, and well, Zhongli obviously isn't. And we know that the 1st descender is pretty much the Heavenly Principles or the primordial one. That leaves the 2nd descender, or rather known in the lore as Second Who Came.
That's what she said.
Anyway, while there's still a whole lot of mystery surrounding the actual identity of the Second Who Came, what we can deduce is that while it wouldn't be that hard to make a suitable connection between Zhongli and the 2nd descender, there are a lot of other lore pieces that also makes it highly illogical for Zhongli to be the 2nd descender. So let's look at it from the theorizer's point of view first of all. Let's give this theory a bit more of a chance. The easiest way to make a connection to their theory is of course to say Zhongli is old, like very old, over 6,000 years old to be precise, and he's gone through so many of the events that Teyvat people would only know as stories. So thinking that he could be the 2nd descender isn't that far-fetched, right? And technically, it really isn't that far-fetched. He is old enough to be there around the time in which the Moon Sisters, Aurea, Sonnet, and Canon killed themselves essentially, which meant that he was old enough to see the Sealy civilization fade away, which also should mean that he was there when Enkanomia fell into the ocean. Because, well, Sealy courts exist there, and they are in much better shape there than what we see here in Teyvat. Here in Teyvat, I don't live there. But anyways, it is all quite probable until you reconsider the lore between the 2nd descender and the Heavenly Principles. This is the descender who came out of nowhere? Well, ostensibly the heavens, since they were referred to as the second throne of the heavens to fight the primordial one, essentially breaking Teyvat into pieces, and was eventually able to inflict enough damage upon the primordial one until they were forced to create the Gnosis and the Archonhood in order to make sure that they can still have that form of authority over Teyvat, because they can no longer sustain that absolute authority on their own due to the aftermath of battling with the second who came. So, if Zhongli was the second descender, what makes you think that the heavenly principles, the same beings that banned the knowledge of the war with the second descender and the sovereigns from the people of Teyvat, the same beings that cursed Egeria with a prophecy of the absolute drowning of her people because Egeria went against one of their rules, and the same beings that sealed Orobashi's fate to death, all because they discovered the story of the old war? Yeah, those guys. Think about it. What makes you think that they are then going to look at the guy who basically disabled their ability to apply full authority over their lands and say, hey, you know what? You may be the one who's been the biggest pain in the ass for us to deal with, and you basically caused us to permanently lose a part of our power. How would you like to be one of the ruling gods under us, where we will give you authority over one of the elements we created, and you definitely cannot use it to go against us in the future? See, it doesn't really stick. And let's be clear here, that would have happened at a time where Celestia would still be enacting those types of punishments on beings that go against them, because they are not the Celestia of now who, the more we are learning about the story, are presumably looking more like vegetables sitting on a fancy rock in the sky. They might not even be doing that anymore with how Natlan's quest went. The Celestia of then would have definitely still been the type to just pancake flip a nation upside down just because they didn't adhere to their guidelines, which, well, they did. Remember this, Conria? Yeah? That was 500 years ago. Compared to the time when all the shit happened with the second descender, 500 years was practically last week. Besides, everything that fought against the heavenly principles back then have already been noted to either be dead or have ended up running away into the Dark Sea. They're not just gonna let a guy who wreaked that kind of havoc in their territory run around all free willy-nilly for 6,000 years, let alone rise up to godhood within their realms. Not if they can help it anyways. However, I think a more concrete theory that counters this Zhongli Descender one is this little theory that I came up with because I was trying to find the discrepancies within that Zhongli theory, and what my theory centers around has everything to do with character story 5 that the second half of the Zhongli Descender theory nails on. More specifically, it has something to do with the nature of these character stories, not just Zhongli's, but every one of the ones we have from every character. Let me pose you this question. I don't know if you ever wondered this before, but whenever you're reading one of these character stories, have you ever wondered or asked, what are we reading? As in, who wrote them? Well, of course, you can always say it's just the game's database telling us, the players, about the characters. There's nothing more to it, and fair enough, I can certainly agree to that. But with how the changes that Rukkhadevata created managed to affect these entries, it made me think about the nature of how this information came to be in a bit of a deeper scale. As we understand it, these character stories are always told in a third-person perspective, bar the traveler's own character profile, which instead of simply retelling our story, it tells us as if it is speaking to us from a second-person perspective. So these entries pretty much indicate that there is an existence of a third party who are telling these stories to us, or at least informing us of these stories. And unlike the people who are theorizing about Zhongli's descender status, who treats these character stories as sort of a character monologue, I'm inclined to think that these stories are actual records about these characters that are stored somewhere. Say, like a massive tree that acts as a repository for all the information regarding everything and everyone that happened and came from Teyvat. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So I think that while the character voice lines can be attributed to be what the characters would canonically and personally say to the traveler, certain degree of closeness, I'd like to think that what we are reading in the character stories are parts of what is stored in Irminsul, that recants the history of what made that character become the person or being that they are now. Because where else would you find that sort of information? Even for someone as old as Zhongli, it has entries in it that describes how Zhongli himself would be feeling about something from way back when, without having the need for him to deliver it in a line of dialogue. And the fact that these stories change with the events of the game must mean that something is updating it, or something is making it change in a way that follows the new flow. The Descender theorizers also missed Zhongli's voice line about Nahida, which only appears after you do the Sumeru Archon quest, in which he basically said that Nahida is the one to have shouldered the responsibility of handling Irminsul, and that the credit of saving Irminsul goes to her. When we know for a fact that Rukkhadevata played a huge part in both realizing that the corruption stems from her, and that the way to save Irminsul was to remove her from it, and she was the one who made sure that they would have another god that will be capable of removing her from Irminsul when the time is right, because as we know, even gods can't purge themselves from Irminsul, and only when another god or being of the same capability does it will purging actually work. Zhongli would have definitely said something about it if he had remembered. This is the guy who praised and acknowledged the fact that Furina had to forgo her divinity, knows how A would react to his death, and is also the guy who remembers stuff from thousands of years ago. He's not just gonna say nothing about Rukkhadevata. And the fact that his character story still mentioned in 2 separate occasions that only 2 of the original 7 Archons are still in positions of rulership or is alive is for me another big indicator that these entries are not written by some random third-party being that just happened to be taking notes of these characters in certain times of their history. One, it's not only because Nahida is now considered the rebirth of the OG Archon, which makes her the OG Archon in her people's eyes regardless. However, Irminsul takes that rebirth as her becoming another being, and is also an explanation that fills the void that Rukkhadevata as the original would have left behind, which in turn inputs Nahida as a reincarnation of Rukkhadevata, but removes Nahida from being one of the original 7s as a result of Irminsul's own self-correction process. The way I viewed Rukkhadevata's removal from Irminsul is never as simple as her just being deleted and then recycled binned out of the computer. The way I've always seen it is that she is still there. It's just that she's someone like a node that just randomly exists within a program, in between thousands of computer code lines that doesn't lead or connect to anything anymore. It's just there. It exists, but it just doesn't do anything, so nothing thinks anything of it, links to it, or remembers it. At least at the moment, because while it probably is obscenely difficult, it is a thing now that even removed existence from Irminsul can be reconnected. Granted, if there's a being with powerful enough capabilities and authority to use Irminsul, and there is someone who is able to become the cornerstone that would piece together the memories of the existence, in which for Rukkhadevata's case, would be us, the Traveler. And second, we know this thing is not just compiled out of random accounts from people in history who have encountered these characters, because if that were the case, then Zhongli's character stories would have been littered with updates that pertain to Rex Lapis's presumed death. Because unless you're an Adepti, or you're some members of the Liachising, presumably anyways, it was lightly hinted that they know about this, then if you were just an average Liyue person, or someone who is simply keeping up with the news of Tevat like the 2 Fatui members that are for some reason still in Mondstadt in the exact same place, then you wouldn't know that Rex Lapis is indeed still alive. So those records, if indeed just made by someone of current Tevat, should have said that only one of the original 7 is still alive. But Irminsul knows, and it still categorizes Zhongli as the Archon of Liyue because he didn't die. The people of Liyue looks like they didn't even bother moving on to then elect another Archon, and some of them don't even think that he's dead, I guess. And that Geo's seat of divinity still very much belongs to Zhongli, since we know that the authority of the element doesn't seem to be chained exclusively with the Gnosis, since so far, 1 Archon is dead without doing anything to the Gnosis. 4 of them don't have a Gnosis anymore. 1 still has hers, but it looks like she's gonna lose it anytime soon. And then the last one has 5 of them right now. And does she now hold authority over all 5 of those elements? Doesn't seem to be the case. The people of each nation still seem to think that their current Archon is the valid Archon, except for Fontaine, who, you know. And this is also why the character story for us the Traveler has missing holes in it, because Irminsul doesn't know. And another thing that could be attributed to why there are already records of us, even though Nahida that one time said she couldn't find any record of us in Irminsul, if you want a more fantastical reason, is probably because of the Loom of Fate. Our sibling has mentioned that it is working now, and it also isn't too far-fetched to say that they might already had this sort of technology back when Khandria was still in full force. They could already be implanting this information to form as a guide or as a retelling of their own story and injecting it through some leyline method that we have yet to see, but we now know is certainly possible. Of course, in my opinion, the more concrete way of looking at things, and the way that I like to see it the most, is that our story now exists as records in Irminsul because it is a retelling of our story, but it is not simply through the observations that Irminsul has made on its own. Because as we know, the Traveler is a descender, and Nahida said she couldn't find any information of us in Irminsul. But what is it that's recorded in Irminsul now that can make it so that our records exist the way it does, even if we ignore all the connections that we made with the people of Teyvat that we've personally encountered? That's right, our siblings' records. Because look at these character stories, it is told as if it was made with the observation of the other person who had been keeping an eye on our movements, had been there on their own, and personally knows us enough to the extent of having the knowledge of our own history prior to Teyvat, which Irminsul on its own wouldn't have had the ability to discern. But if it were inputted by your sibling through their perspective as someone who is now a part of Teyvat, then Irminsul can definitely do that. Because who else would have known that the ruler of the abyss, the one who traveled with you and crossed through many worlds with, had been watching you as you finish up your journey in Mondstadt? It could only be our sibling, who is the one who have been watching us that whole time. Cause look at this excerpt. Yet there was something you did not see, for as the dragon fell to the abyss, a certain figure had been reflected in its eyes. The one who ruled the abyss, she had once traveled with you, and you had once crossed many worlds together. It's not even talking about that last Mondstadt Archon Quest cutscene where the sibling was finally revealed to be part of the abyss. It's talking about the moment where we finally purified the Valen in that battle. They were there to see that part of the battle. And it would make perfect sense for the entries to our character story 3 and above to still be empty, because ever since that moment where we first met them in the first Traveler quest, they had been busy trying to get the Loom of Fate back online. And a lot of the abyssal supervision that we've encountered during that period had been mostly from lectors and heralds. And even when we meet again in Carrybear's domain, that occasion doesn't count because apparently neither of us are supposed to remember anything about it other than the picture that Carrybear somehow spawned out of the domain for us. Yeah, screw you too, Hoyo. Hell, even our character profile description sounds like something that our sibling left in our Irminsul records for us to see later on in our journey. The Keeper is fading away. The Creator has not yet come, but the world shall burn no more, for you shall ascend. No one in the game story has ever said those words to us. We have never spoken these sorts of words ourselves, and there is really no one else that would have that sort of knowledge to be saying those types of words to us other than our sibling. Not only does this tease us about what the state of Teyvat's past had actually looked like, but it also gives us some sort of premonition of the type of role that we should be expecting to find in our journey to the future. Whether it is that we as the new descender and I guess the new heir that is supposed to find the light becomes the new creator, or whether or not it pertains to another heavenly being, only our sibling, the heavenly principles, or the abyss would probably know. And it would be cool, in my opinion, to think that this sort of Irminsul theory of the records can run parallel to how Dainsleif is the one who narrates the collected miscellanies for each of the characters.
I am content to watch most crises play out from the sidelines. But if Albedo were ever to make a single wrong move, I could not let myself ignore it.
we have someone who is associated with Khaenri'ah and by extension the Abyss, telling us about these characters from outside the game from a canonically accurate standpoint, while we have the records of Irminsul itself which we can access from within the game. And something else that I just realized, and I even went back into the game to make sure of it, is that it makes even more sense, especially if we were to access the archive book from the game's pause screen, which stores all the information about everything and everyone that we've encountered in Teyvat that isn't a playable character. Not only is the archive book not actually a book, unless there exists a book in which the pages are literally stars and the universe, but the background and overall look of the sky, the ground layer, and all the aesthetics looks very similar to what the inner domain of Irminsul had looked like when we accessed it with Scaramouche back in Sumeru's Interlude Archon quest, all the way down to the particle effects that ends up rising out of and surrounding the book. Even the background of our quest journal that takes note of all the quests that we've done in our accounts gameplay have the same exact background. While the story quest and hangout events that we have yet to do simply have a normal pause screen because Irminsul have not taken record of it, since our individual versions of the Traveler that is linked to our real progress as a player have not gone through it. Therefore, it is not an event that would have been recorded within that Traveler's Irminsul just yet. And that's also why the character archives have the Irminsul background, because regardless of whether or not we have pulled for them as playable characters, these people exist in Teyvat and are therefore already recorded in Irminsul by default. Damn! I literally just realized all that as I was finishing up the recording, so this is some real thinking shit that I just went through here. At the end of it all, that is why I both think that the records we've been reading in this game have all been what is collated in Irminsul, but also why the notion that Zhongli is a descender seems very improbable, because evidently there are larger evidences of him actually being affected by Irminsul instead of him not being affected and being a descender at the same place. And it's not even erosion, that thing is completely separate from Irminsul effects. It's just basically a thing that I guess the Heavenly Principles placed as a failsafe on Teyvat's older existences to make them have dementia sooner or later, so that doesn't play into this at all. Okay, so this script has gone longer than what I anticipated it to be, but this whole thing just reminded me how much I love Genshin's lore and why it is that I stayed in this game in the first place. Thank you for those of you who have made it this far. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this as much as I did, and if you did, feel free to leave a like, and if you have some thoughts of your own, do feel free to leave it in the comments down below. Until the next video, my name's Leafy, and I'll see you all next time. Sayonara.